you so much for making time to do this, especially in such a busy week for you with so many world leaders visiting Washington, D.C. It's 100 degrees outside.
It's 100 degrees outside, it is, but we're thrilled to have everyone here in Washington for this 75th anniversary summit for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why 75 years later, NATO is still important. I think sometimes it's easy to think it's just some group over there. It's far removed. The average American doesn't see how it impacts their life. And I'm wondering if you can tell us just directly from you, why is NATO important?
Well, I think one of the things to remember is why NATO came together in the first place. The world had just been through 2 world wars that had devastated so much of the globe. And there was a determination around the world, and especially in the United States, to try to make sure that it never happened again. And one of the ways to do that is in bringing countries together in collective self-defense, because what's important to understand about NATO is it's a defensive alliance. Its purpose is to prevent war, to prevent conflict, not to start wars. And the idea was really powerful. NATO started with 12 countries 75 years ago, and they pledged that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. And the idea was that if a would-be aggressor out there knows that in attacking one country, they've got to take on all of the countries that are part of the alliance, they might say, wait a minute, not such a good idea. And that's at the heart of the NATO idea. So 75 years later, the alliance is still there. It's the most successful, enduring alliance in history. And it's an alliance that now brings 32 countries together, not just the original 12. And that tells you that year after year, decade after decade, more and more countries have thought that their own security could best be guaranteed if they were part of this group. And for the United States, for us, the only time that commitment to jump in if one of the allies is attacked actually was after 9/11, when the United States was attacked and all of our allies came and joined us as necessary in Afghanistan. So I think it's just a reminder that we've been together for 75 years, and the dogs that didn't bark, the wars that didn't happen, the conflicts that never took place, because aggressors knew that they'd have to take on all of us, that's why this alliance remains so important.
I want to talk about the war in Ukraine. What happens if Russia wins?
If Russia wins, 2 things happen. First of all, it's not going to, but just for the hypothetical, let's go there. First, it's devastating for the people of Ukraine, for the men, women, and children who are trying to protect their country, protect themselves, and protect their right to decide their future. Russia shouldn't have the right to decide Ukraine's future. The Ukrainian people should. But it's even bigger than that, because were Russia to succeed in Ukraine, then would-be aggressors everywhere, not just in Europe, but well beyond, would say, if they could get away with it, we can get away with it. And that's a recipe for a world with more conflict, with more aggression, with more war. And of course, in Ukraine itself, in Europe itself, if Putin were to succeed somehow in Ukraine, it's almost certain he wouldn't stop there. Other countries in Europe could be threatened, including NATO countries. And then that brings us in, because if a NATO country is attacked, we're committed to helping to defend it. So that's why it's so important that Ukraine succeed, and it is succeeding. Putin his first objective was to erase it from the map, to eliminate its independence, to basically subsume it into a greater Russia. That has failed. It can't succeed. Now our task is to make sure that Ukraine emerges as a strong, independent, successful country, and that's what we're working on every day.
I know that NATO has a commitment to, at some point, no stated timeline, but at some point bringing Ukraine into the alliance. And Ukraine has expressed over and over, let us in, like they would be in later tonight if you'd put the paperwork in front of them. Does allowing Ukraine to become part of this mutual defense alliance, does that put the United States at more risk? Does it make the world less safe because that could potentially spread the conflict? If Ukraine joins, Putin's very unhappy about that. Suddenly the entire NATO alliance has to respond. Does allowing Ukraine in, doesn't that spread the conflict?
Well, I don't think it does. But first, when it comes to any prospective member of the alliance, there are two things that are important. One is the alliance is open to countries that would like to join it. That's a basic principle. But they also have to be prepared to contribute effectively to the common defense. They have to be strong militarily, but also strong democratically to make sure that they also are not only part of an alliance that brings together countries in the common purpose of preventing aggression, but these are countries that have something in common, their own democracies. So for any country that seeks to join, there's a process, and there's making sure that they meet the basic criteria, the basic requirements of having militaries that can contribute to the alliance and that are strong democracies. But I think NATO, the alliance has been clear. Ukraine will become a member of NATO when the conditions are right and when all of the allies agree. That's what we said last year. I actually think that being part of the alliance is the best deterrent to more aggression, to more war, to more conflict, because again, you know if you're taking on one member, you're taking on all of them. So one of the reasons I think we haven't seen thus far Russia attack any NATO member is because Putin knows if he goes at one, he gets all.
I've heard some people talking about how the only reason Putin is attacking Ukraine is because he wants to keep them out of NATO. And certainly it's a multifaceted conflict. But what is your take on that? Is he slow walking the war so that he can prevent them from becoming a member? Is he intentionally attacking them? You know, we saw this big strike yesterday on the eve of the NATO conference. Is he sending a message by, you know, striking a children's hospital the day before all of the NATO leaders come to the United States? Is this sort of carrot of someday Ukraine will be in, is that prolonging the war?
You know, before the Russian aggression against Ukraine, when we had information that they were planning it and plotting it, and which we shared with the world, we also engaged intensely with the Russians themselves. Many conversations, including lengthy meetings I had with the foreign minister of Russia, to try to figure out what was going on. And was this really about Russia's sense somehow of insecurity, their concern about Ukraine one day joining the alliance, other ways that they might somehow see this as a threat? Or was this about, unfortunately, the ambitions of Putin to erase Ukraine from the map and to recreate a greater Russia? So we tested this idea, and we said, let's talk about what arrangements could be put in place if you really have security concerns that would answer those concerns. But the reality is that's not what it was about. It was always about, and Putin himself has said it, eliminating Ukraine as an independent country. Now, do they want Ukraine to be part of NATO? No, absolutely not, because they think that would further guarantee its independence. But that's not what's driving the aggression. It's not what's driving the conflict. Now, unfortunately, there's no sign right now that Russia's prepared to actually end this war and negotiate a real peace, a peace that upholds the basic principles that are at the heart of the United Nations Charter, for example, that one country can't simply grab another country's land by force. The minute we see evidence of that, we're there to try to work out an arrangement. We haven't seen it. You mentioned the attack on the children's hospital. I visited that hospital on one of my trips to Ukraine. I met the children who were patients there. Some of them who've actually been wounded or hurt in the war. Others who, for example, are working to overcome cancer.
Is he trying to send a message to NATO of like, look at what I can do? I know y'all are meeting over there, but look at what I got going on
I think
over
he
here.
tries to send those signs on a regular basis, but the answer is NATO. It's the many countries, including countries beyond NATO, that are supporting Ukraine. President Biden pulled together 50 countries when the Russians first attacked to support Ukraine, to make sure that it had what it needed to defend itself, to put pressure on Russia. Countries not just in Europe, but as far afield as Asia, Japan, Korea. Those 50 countries are sending a very strong message to Putin. You can't outlast Ukraine. You can't outlast us. The NATO summit, in showing that there's a clear bridge for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, that also sends the message to Putin. You're not going to outlast us.
I have millions of followers. They have sent me questions that they want me to ask you, and of course we don't have time to get to all the questions. But I have two that I really want to give voice to. One is Isn't this a regional conflict on the other side of the world? This doesn't, why should my tax money, my hard-earned tax money, be going to what is a conflict that does not affect me? That's one thing that I think many Americans wonder about.
So I guess I'd say two things. First, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not just the United States that's helping to defend Ukraine. It's more than 50 countries. And for all of the resources that we put into it, taxpayer dollars, our partners in Europe and beyond have put in even more to help Ukraine militarily, to help it economically, to help it with its people who need the humanitarian assistance. So this is maybe the best example I've seen of many countries coming together and shouldering the burden together. Second, again, what's of real concern to me is that if Putin is allowed to do what he did in Ukraine with impunity, and no one stands up against him and stops him, then it doesn't stop there. It continues with, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, aggression against other countries in Europe, including countries that are members of NATO, which, under the agreement that we have with NATO, would have us do more to help defend them. Other parts of the world where aggressive countries are looking at this and seeing, does Putin get away with it? If he does, then I do. And the history of the last century really tells us that when conflicts start in one place or another, one way or another, inevitably the United States gets pulled in. And it's much better to try to stop things up front than to wind up having to pick up the pieces afterward. We know that inevitably we'll actually pay a higher price. So for us, right now, we have most of our allies and partners who are picking up the lion's share of this. The money that we're putting into this ourselves, the money that's coming from the taxpayers, actually, most of it's invested in the United States, in our industries, to produce the necessary defense equipment that Ukraine needs. That's actually providing good American jobs.
The next thing that people really want me to ask you about is, does NATO care about the war in Gaza? And what, if anything, are world leaders from NATO? I understand that Gaza is not, part of the North Atlantic. We do understand that. This is an area of grave concern for many people in America and around the world. And what would you have to say to them?
It's of grave concern to the President, to me, to all of us. And we're working every single day to try to bring it to an end as quickly as possible, to end the horrific suffering of children, of women, of men who are caught in this crossfire that Hamas started when it attacked Israel on October 7th. The best way to do that is to get a ceasefire. And we've been working to get one for many, many weeks now. I'm hopeful that we can get there. President Biden put out a proposal about a month ago now that the entire world got behind. Country after country came out in support of it. Countries in the region, well beyond. The United Nations Security Council, which often doesn't agree these days, came together almost unanimously, 14 out of the 15 countries in support. The Russians didn't block the support, but they didn't get with it. So the entire world came out for this proposal. Israel is committed to it. We're waiting to see if Hamas will actually say yes. So there's been a lot of back and forth over the last couple of weeks, including right now, to see if we can get that agreement. If we do, we get a ceasefire. Hostages come home, including Americans. People forget that among the many people that Hamas took hostage on October 7th, they're Americans, and we're determined to bring them home to their families too. That's the best path forward to ending the suffering. Every leader of a NATO country is concerned with this because it's affecting them too. Publics in all of these countries are deeply concerned with the suffering in Gaza, with the war in Gaza. We want to bring it to an end as fast as we can. The ceasefire idea, the proposal, is the best way to do it.
A lot of people, and I'm just going to tell you what people tell me. They want me to tell you the things. They feel like if the war could end if the United States would stop equipping Israel.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. I know one hears that, but the reality is this, and this is not by way of justifying any particular thing that Israel's done. It's by way of explaining. The attack of October 7th, I think, has been forgotten or put to the side by many people. What they don't fully understand is the impact this had not just on a particular Israeli government or leader, but on virtually the entirety of Israeli society. And Israel was determined to do everything that it could to make sure that October 7th never happened again, that terrorists couldn't come streaming across its border, slaughter men, women, and children, retreat, and be able to do it again which Hamas said that it wanted to do if given the opportunity. Now, we said from the start that it was very important that Israel be able to defend itself and do what it could to prevent October 7th from happening again. But we also said it's vital how they do that, including trying to make sure that innocent people caught in the middle of this don't suffer. But I believe that irrespective of what any other outside country did, the United States or any other country, including strong supporters of Israel, Israel was determined to carry this fight. We've worked every day to try to make sure that, again, it was done in a way that didn't cause so many innocents to suffer, that the support got to them, that they were protected, and that this could be brought to an end. Right now, the best way to do that, the quickest way to do that, is an agreement on a ceasefire.
What do you view as the Biden administration's greatest foreign policy successes?
Well, I think there are individual things that are important, but I think it's really the president's approach from day one that was so important. And he really said two things. Our success and strength in the world is tied to our success and strength at home, and vice versa. So what does that mean? First, it meant that investing in our strength at home, investing in our roads and bridges and communications networks, as he did through the Infrastructure Act, or in the cutting-edge technology that the United States has invented and needs to remain a leader in, like chips and computers, or all of this climate technology that's going to be a big part of the economy of the next century, this century and ensuing centuries. All of these investments that he made at home, that has strengthened us not only at home, but around the world. Countries see that we're committed to investing in ourselves and in our strength. But the flip side of that coin is that for the president, the most critical thing to do from the get-go was to reinvigorate, rejuvenate, reimagine even our partnerships and alliances, because as strong as we are, as successful as we are, we're going to be so much more effective if we're doing things together with other countries, not alone. None of the problems that we have to deal with that are affecting the lives of people in the United States can be effectively dealt with the United States going off on its own, not trying to enlist other countries, other partners in helping us to solve them. And the great advantage that we have is countries want to work with us. A Russia and a China, they sometimes coerce or pressure other countries into joining them. The United States, it's voluntary because these are countries that are like-minded, that have the same kind of values. But when we're working at common purpose, we can get things more effectively done. So if you care about climate change, even if we do everything right at home, we're about 15, maybe 20% of global emissions, it doesn't solve the problem. You've got to get the other 80% of emissions coming from other countries. So we have to find ways to partner with them. If you care about a pandemic and what this did to our country, even if we do everything right at home, if there's a weak link in the chain out there somewhere, we know it's going to come back to bite us. So we have a strong interest in working with other countries to find better defenses against pandemics. And if you care about preventing wars, making sure that there aren't conflicts, then the more that we can unite with other countries and say, we're going to defend ourselves together, the more likely it is that you won't have a war in the first place. That's what NATO is all about. So the president was determined to rebuild these alliances and partnerships, which unfortunately had fallen into a lot of disarray in the previous years. And we've done that. Just to give you one quick example, coming back to NATO, which we're celebrating. Way back in 2014, President Obama got an agreement that every NATO country would dedicate at least 2% of its GDP, of its economy, to defense, just to make sure that everyone was carrying their weight. Of the allies in NATO, when President Biden took office, only 9 were meeting that mark. Today, 3.5 years later, 23 of the allies are meeting that mark. And that means that it's not just the United States pulling the sled. We've got more and more allies and partners who are making the necessary commitments so that we're doing it together. So I think if you look around the world, whether it's what we were able to do in bringing so many countries together to defend Ukraine, whether it's what we've done to get more and more countries working together to deal with some of the challenges posed by China, whether it's success we've had in Asia in bringing more and more countries together, whether it's work we've done on food security, on health security, on energy security. It all starts with a strong foundation of allies and partners, and it all starts with a strong foundation at home in making sure that we're approaching all of these things from a position of strength. And I think if I'm looking back, the greatest successes the President has in making sure that we had that foundation in place and then using it to try to solve problems.
Just super fast follow-up. Has there ever been a time in your a student of history, obviously, in order to be good at being a Secretary of State, you have to know world history. Has there ever been a time when United States isolationism has been the right move?
If there has been, I haven't seen it. I mean, just think about quickly the period between World War I and World War II. We came out of World War I and we had a choice to make, having gone to the rescue of Europe, but also of democracy. And the choice was whether to really lean in and remain engaged or not. And we pulled back. We decided not to join the League of Nations, which is what became the United Nations. We saw the rise of dictators and autocrats, and we became isolationists. We said, not our problem. We're gonna pull back. There were some economic problems. We became totally protectionist. We're not going to engage in the world. And yeah, we had waves of migration, new people coming to America. But there was a kind of xenophobic pushback against all of it. Obviously, it has to be follow the law, it has to be orderly, it has to be safe, but there was a real pushback. And we got World War II. We got an economic global depression. We got a global war. We got a genocide against the Jews and others. And then after World War II, we had to ask ourselves the same question. What do? Does everyone just come home and hunker down? We didn't do that. Do we use the great power that we had after World War II? We were really first among equals then because so many other countries had been totally devastated by the war. Do we use that position to just dictate to everyone else? We didn't do that. Instead, we led the way with other countries in creating a new system that had basic understandings about how countries relate to each other, with rules, with norms, the United Nations and its charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, organizations like NATO. And in a way, it was not so intuitive because we basically constrained ourselves to the same rules and norms as other countries when we didn't have to do that, but we did. But that's what brought others along. And we made investments in others too, the Marshall Plan. But what happened there? Those investments came back to us 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times because suddenly we had new partners who could help us deal with these global problems that we couldn't handle alone. We had new allies to prevent aggression from happening in the first place. We had new markets to sell the things that we made here in the United States. It's something that we called enlightened self-interest. It wasn't just out of the goodness of our hearts. It was because it was in the interest of the United States to be engaged, to make these investments because we knew it would come back to benefit us. And it would also help prevent conflict from happening again. That was the decision that we made then. And I think in a very different world now, with maybe a greater multiplicity of problems, a greater complexity of problems, those basic principles still matter. Because if we retreat, we're not going to get the job done. If we retreat, someone else will fill the vacuum, and probably not in a way that advances our interests or values, or maybe no one does. And then I can tell you, you get a vacuum that's almost always filled by bad things before it's filled by good things, and it will bring us in one way or the other, but at a lot more cost, at a lot more danger. So I think for me, looking back at history, there's a greater premium than there's ever been on U.S. engagement, on U.S. leadership, but also on finding ways to work with, cooperate with, coordinate with other countries. That's what our diplomacy is about. That's what our foreign policy is about. That's the vision that President Biden not only set, but that he's been implementing for the last 3.5 years.
Secretary Blinken, thank you so much for your time. It was great to
Sharon.
meet you,
Thanks,
and I
Sharon.
appreciate listening.
Great to be with
Thank
you.
Thanks so much.